Hello everyone, and welcome to this masterclass on youth transitions. This is the seventh of our masterclasses, which are our monthly series of seminars and skills-related issues. Previous topics have included apprenticeships and the relationship with occupation, the role of business strategy in shaping skills demand and long-term training trends. All of those previous sessions are all available on our YouTube channel, and of course all of these sessions are done in partnership with Lakes, our partners at Lakes, which is the Centre for Learning and Life Chances in Knowledge Economies and Societies, which is an ESRC-funded research centre at the Institute for Education. This is the last in the current series of these masterclasses, although they will be starting up again in the spring, so do watch this space. So as I said, this is a session on youth transition, so very lucky to have with us Karen Evans, who is a Professor of Education at the Institute of Education, University of London, and research theme leader for young people, intergenerational mobility and civic values. Karen's main fields of research are learning in life and work transitions and learning in and through the workplace. And also we have with us Ingrid Schoon, who is Professor of Human Development and Social Policy at the Institute of Education, University of London, and her research interests are focused on psychosocial demands during transition from dependent childhood to independent adulthood, social and gender equalities in attainment, health and well-being, the study of risk and resilience, very busy, and the realisation of individual potential in changing socio-historical contexts. So, as I said, welcome everyone, and without further ado, hand it straight over to Karen and Ingrid to take us through. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting us, and thank you for coming. We're doing a bit of a double act here. We're very conscious about the time pressures, and so we want to stop talking. We are resolved to stop talking by 22:12 at the very latest, so we have 20 minutes of discussion. And I'm going to kick off, and Ingrid, if you could kind of signal to me just gone quarter past, then I'll hand over to you. I'm going to open really with some ideas and some reference to sources of evidence in this field of youth transitions. Before we move on to looking at particular projects, new findings that are coming out, which are going to be related to and compared with findings from previous research to show some of the latest trends. So let's move on. Transition, first of all, what do we mean by it? What do we understand by it? So for our purposes here, we're seeing it in these terms. A dense period involving assumption of multiple social roles by young people, which sets the scene for adult functioning and adjustment. It's formative and risk-laden and shaped by previous experience and current conditions. There are lots of debates that go on around this, of course. For example, how long does transition last? You can't put fixed ages on it, but most people now are talking about 16 to the mid-20s. In the past, sometimes people have been thinking about it in terms of 16 to 19. That's expanded. In continental Europe, it's 16 to 30, which would bring some of you in this room within the scope of being in a youth transition. So that's one of the debating areas. Another debate is, well, what is it that young people are transitioning to exactly? It's often expressed in terms of a movement from to something to a movement, through a movement to something else. But another debate is maybe we should be thinking a bit more in terms of what are you becoming, rather than what are you travelling from and travelling to. It's also multifaceted. We know that it's not just about employment transitions, but it's about housing transitions, it's about domestic transitions, it's about interrelationships, family, moving from your family of origin into longer term relationships outside the family. And we know that the previous experiences and current conditions are very important in shaping all that. We know from previous research, for example, very well established now, we know the scarring effects of being neat and its effect longer term. We also know the effects of early experiences of success in the labour market, how that can build confidence and has longer term effects and so on. So previous experiences and current conditions are very important in the way we think about and understand transition. Youth transitions research is a very rich field, and I make this point actually because I think quite often both policymakers and researchers kind of get excited about the latest new research and kind of forget about its antecedents, and there are some very rich veins of previous research, and there is also a fair amount of reinventing of the wheel. Of course, contexts change, but there are some enduring lessons that have come from prior research. I couldn't possibly list all of it, but I just give some examples here. The ESRC 16 to 19 initiative took place in the 1980s, produced a lot of publications around notions of careers and identities. Then there was a youth citizenship and social change programme. Both of these were funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, very large-scale grants. This youth citizenship and social change programme had about 19 or 20 projects in the end, looking at all these different facets of transitions, including employment transitions. And then there were the youth cohort studies that took place over a long period of time. And then there are the more general cohort studies that provide a lot of information about youth. There's a lot of international studies as well, comparative, and these are very useful because they, when you look at UK youth research in the context of international studies, it lifts you out of the assumptions you make about your own your own system and your own situation. Lots of commonalities in these projects, for example, the Pathways project and mapping youth transitions in Europe. Youth unemployment issues are held in common across all of those countries, but when you actually look at the research, you find that there are big cultural differences, big differences in family support, in cultural expectations about what young people are meant to be doing, in the platform that's provided by the educational system, big differences in the educational system, whether it's tracked or whether it's comprehensive or whatever, big differences in labour markets. And then within Lakes itself, as I said, we've got a youth theme between 2013 and 2018. The theme I lead is about intergenerational dynamics and youth. We've got a cluster of projects there, including things like student debt and the effect on choices, getting into and getting on in the labour market, looking at new kinds of entry practices in the youth labour market. Youth and civic values, and also looking at mechanics and processes of intergenerational transmission, which is a project Ingrid and I are working on. There's a link here to the newsletter that takes you into a different universe, so I won't click on it. Metaphors of youth transitions have changed over time. The dominant, they coexist, but the dominant metaphors have changed over time. This first image I've got here is the first metaphor I wanted to talk about very briefly is the one of filling niches in the labour markets, and this is from a Victorian engraving of a factory that was mass producing statues, if you like, figures to the specifications of customers, and that was a dominant kind of metaphor in the 1960s and went along with manpower planning approaches. It's about fitting people into and predicting the gaps in the labour market, the niches in the labour market into which you wanted to fit people. The pathways metaphor is a more recent one that started to become dominant as more options seemed to be opening up for young people. But the trajectories metaphor said, well, actually, all of these options is a bit illusory, because actually young people are being launched onto trajectories. And if you take your angle of projection and the speed and the velocity of your projection will determine eventually where you land, and an awful lot of this is predetermined by origins. You're actually talking about trajectories and predicted destinations. And then the most recent metaphor, I would say, is that of navigations. We're talking about people navigating changing circumstances. I capture this in the lone canoeist shooting the rapids. But of course the important thing to remember here is that this lone canoeist is exercising skill and judgment and all of these sorts of things, and the environment is quite turbulent. But rather a lot depends on the quality of the canoe and the paddle as well. So there's a resources issue involved again. So just an indication of how metaphors of the way people talk about youth transitions have changed. And we now hear much more talk about how young people are navigating turbulent times, often with an emphasis on the skill and abilities, but you need to keep in mind the resources they've got at their disposal as well. Availability of large-scale data sets and cohort studies is enabling us to look at how lives actually unfold over time, instead of conceptualising the life course as we assume it to be, or getting too caught up in these kinds of metaphors. Gives insights into the driving forces behind and within transitions. And when we look at the evidence from cohort studies, we find that it challenges some commonly held assumptions, as you'll see in a minute from Ingrid talks, and particularly assumptions about the linearity of transitions and the extent of diversity. It shows how multifaceted, how multidimensional transitions are, and sometimes reversible. They don't always go in one direction. There's been mounting evidence in research of the kind that I talked about earlier, of the resources that young people draw on when they're making transitions. And there are two types of resources that strongly influence patterns of youth transition. There are structural resources that include things like parental affluence and social networks. And then there are personal and agentic resources, which include young people's cognitive and non-cognitive abilities, their motivations and aspirations. And then James Cote's work talks about identity capital, identity-based agency, and well-being itself is argued by Cote to be part of personal and agentic resources. And when you look at the interplay of these things, the structural resources and the personal and agentic resources, then you kind of get some patterns coming out which can be simplified like this. When structural resources are high and personal agentic resources are high, you tend to find advantages that young people experience compound, they're additive, they accumulate. This is where young people with a lot of parental backing and good social networks will act on that, can take chances that are presented to them, and their advantages increase and compound in the labour market and other areas. This is my last one, Ingrid. When structural resources are low, but personal agentic resources are high, then what happens is that young people can take chances, they go for opportunities, they don't have necessarily the parental backing and resources. They can make considerable gains, but the gains are sometimes more uncertain, and they're subject to higher risks. Taking a chance to become more mobile, taking the chance of a change of direction, loading yourself with a load of student debt with the prospect of what that might lead to. These are quite high risk if you haven't got the backing of parental resources, you haven't got any safety nets. So young people can go for it, but its gains are more uncertain. Then you've got structural resources high, but personal agentic resources low. This is where young people who've got a lot of advantages from their background don't capitalise on that, can't capitalise on that in some way. Sometimes they're crushed by the weight of parental expectations, for example. And then you've got structural resources low, personal agentic resources low, where you have an increased accumulation of risks through the life course. That's a very oversimplified way. In fact, with prolonged transitions, you're getting quite complex interplay of structural and personal resources, and that's where we move on to the next stage in looking at some new work coming out on that.
So, because this, I think Karen's introduction showed nicely how complex the situation is if you look at more than one factor and look at how one factor combines with another. And in some of the models of youth transition, this is also reflected. Not necessarily in the assumption of a normative approach, which simply states there is a new norm, let's say, of extended youth transitions, that all young people then have an extended transition. I think this has been debated. Yes, there had been a shift of extended education participation, but it does not apply to everybody. On the other hand, it had also been argued that there is increasing individualization, that that young people become increasingly the entrepreneurs of the self, and that is because of de-standardization or de-institutionalization, where previous constraints like gender or social class are increasingly breaking away. More young people participate in education, even those from relatively disadvantaged background, and they bring to this their own agency, which Karin already said can also then lead to diversity and more de-standardization. But on the other hand, it had been argued it's not necessarily the individual that drives this diversity, that it is generally, this diversity is also shaped by this accumulation of resources that Karin also mentioned. If you have everything of everything, then you are more privileged than those who basically have less structural support and have to fend for themselves. So there are cumulative advantages and disadvantages and polarization of resources, which can then reflect in either fast transition, i.e. the traditional way of leaving school early and then finding your way in the labor market, or slow transition, that means extended education participation. Otherwise, it sometimes has also been termed as problematic or smooth transitions, the problematic being those being in and out of employment and having more problems. And building on that it's not only the accumulation of advantage and disadvantage, the transition can also be the opportunity for a turning point, that you change your life, you become more, let's say you come from a problematic family background, and then you use this transition to gain your own independence, to find your way into employment and to be independent. So these young people need the resources. So there is basically a diverse pathway view which emphasizes this transition is a process. It can go in any direction, it's multi-directional, it can have many pathways that need to lead to the same end, as well as the end being achieved by different pathways. So it's multi-directionality, multi-finality, and also the relational dynamic system, where it depends on how the different resources play with each other. And this approach basically emphasizes there is more than one optimal pathway, but it could also be that, for example, somebody from privileged background cannot make it in the transition and fall behind. And I think there are now increasing concerns about downward mobility, that young people cannot achieve the same status as their parents. And this approach would take into account these issues. And then, of course, we also have longitudinal data to test these assumptions, and in this presentation I will draw mostly on the longitudinal study of young people in England, which is now housed at the IOE, and present latest findings post-2000, and also use a methodology that enables us to identify changing patterns and how different role combinations combine with individuals to get a better understanding of the complexities of the life course. And this is just a slide to illustrate also the context, historical context, because Karin has said history can repeat itself. But here you have evidence from, or data collected in the 1970 British birth cohort study, and they basically experienced a major recession just when they completed compulsory schooling at age 16. And similarly, the LSYPE, they had this experience of a major credit crunch just when they were starting out in the labor market and making the transitions for themselves. So again, there is a lot we can learn from what happened to the previous BCS 70 cohort. And to describe transitions in this presentation, it draws on sequence analysis, which allows us to construct typical patterns of transition behavior using month-by-month employment history data on 5 employment states, whether they are employment, unemployed, family activity, full-time education, or sick or other non-participation in the labor market. And we could identify 6 patterns of youth transitions, and I should say that Richard Dorset is in the room. He runs a similar project using these methods to identify types, and these types are quite similar to what they found in the data, but we had this more monthly data and were able to identify a cluster of mostly young people participating in education, the 45%, but even you can see here that this cluster is not so clean. You find that some people maybe return to education or also have some problems in finding their way. Then we could identify a clear cluster of apprenticeships, i.e. those who went into apprenticeships, relatively small, 6%, but that reflects the figure of the LSYPE. And then we found a cluster of 14% employment after further education, mostly staying in education until 17 or 18, and then making it into the labor market. But again, you can see that there are, so green is basically apprenticeships, red color is the employment, and the yellow color means experience of not being in the labor market, not being in education, employment or training. And you can see that even those who stayed in education until 17 or 18 are not having necessarily a smooth transition, but they're still doing better than those who, the 21% who basically left education and compulsory schooling to enter the labor market. And also we find a distinct group of those who had some further education but then experienced need, as well as a group of 6% who were in need throughout the phase of 16 to 19. Well, this is the most at-risk group in this sample. And you can also see that there is quite a variety and diversity in this sample, and while the education pathway or the academic track is well signposted, well supported with number of means, the majority or the forgotten half of young people have to make their way with the least support, because now increasingly support has been withdrawn for them, connection is no longer there, the education maintenance allowance has been taken, so they basically have to make their transition without a safety net, and I think that is a major concern. Because even in this most current cohort, you have the majority of young people who do not go to education, and even if you increase it to 50%, you will still have the other half who does not. So then you can think about what is a positive transition. Is it only going to education and then getting the qualification, or is it also this other track of those who navigate their way through the perilous water of the school to work transition? So what is a successful transition? Is it just doing okay, so being on the average? And this is borrowed from Anne Marston, who worked a lot on adjustment of young people. And doing okay basically describes adjustment within the normal average for a normative cohort. And it also means to meet developmental tasks, such as objective achievements like gaining your qualifications, gaining income, or educational position. It means also subjective evaluations, i.e. whether you're satisfied with your life, and also regarding health and well-being, as Karen also mentioned. And of course, the timing and the sequencing play a role, because there are a lot of assumptions that the fast transition can be quite problematic, because it then leads to a lot of negative outcomes, while this normative transition, in this case of staying on in education, are well prepared, and then if you divert from it, you might have negative consequences. And but these norms generally vary by culture and by historical context, and so there's always the issue of who decides what is a successful transition. And in LSYPE we have some information about life satisfaction, how satisfied young people are with their lives, and you can think about which of the groups might be most satisfied, but you can also look at the evidence, and you can see that those in the academic tracks, as well as those who found employment after education or directly leaving school, have highest levels of life satisfactions, while those who are in need or who have this experience of problematic transitions are less satisfied. But interestingly, this group, even if they struggle to find their way into employment, they feel quite good about their lives. And what factors can predict these transition experiences? That is the next question of how do we know who is in these different clusters or groups of young people. And in this case, we used multiple multinomial regression models using the education cluster as the reference group and using a number of family background and individual characteristics to predict who is in these different tracks. And you can see that those in the apprenticeships, they do not differ according to family background from those who are in education, but they differ regarding their individual characteristics, and they are generally more likely male, they're more likely white young men, and those who basically did not do so well at school previously, who did not have aspirations to go into education, and also who were not really engaged in the school context, who did not like to go to school. And these personal characteristics also characterize those who are in the other 5 clusters or 4 clusters, i.e. employment-related outcomes or the need outcomes, but they are relatively more disadvantaged compared to those who are in the educational track, particularly regarding parental education and also their housing condition. So these seem to be the key factors of family background that might be hindering young people to develop their academic careers in addition, over and above these individual characteristics of attainment and motivation. But then the question also to ask is who is actually beating the odds? Who is defying all this predicting of these trajectories? Either you have the resources or you don't have them, that these predict your pathways. So what are the real factors that matter for enabling young people to make a positive or satisfactory transition, even if the odds are stacked against them? And in this case, we compare experiences also with the BCS 70 cohort to get some handle of, can we generalize our findings that we find in the LSYPE, in the cohort born in the 1989, 1990, to those born in the 1970s. And you can see that just looking at employment experiences at age 18, just taking the cross-sectional data, you can see that young people in LSYPE, they are more likely to participate in education, and they're less likely to be employed or in training, but on the other hand, they also are more likely, or they're more of them experience need. So that is then the danger for this cohort, or the major challenge of the young cohort, to make the way into employment. And we also compared their family backgrounds to get an idea of what are the risks from the structural factors. And you can see that in the later born cohort, the parents are generally better educated than in the previous cohort. They have slightly better jobs. We find more young people growing up in single-parent households, but it's not necessarily being born to a teen mother, because teenage motherhood didn't increase since the 1970s, so it's not the teenage mothers. You have fewer in the later cohort living in social housing, but that basically reflects that there is no more social housing for them to live in, so this also has changed. But you find more young people growing up in a workless household where none of the parents is working, and that despite being the parents better educated. So these young people might witness their parents being educated and still not being able to make it into the labor market, and this again can set signs for them. And then we looked at how do these different family resources or assets or characteristics combine for these individuals, i.e. what are the odds that are stacked against them. And you can see that in the yellow bar for the later born cohorts, there are more young people who have none of these risk factors at all. So they're more better off, they have better educated parents and so on. But on the other hand, you see that 4+ risk factors, there is also more young people in the later born cohort, suggesting that this is this increasing polarization of the risk and these pockets of disadvantage that are really emerging for this later born cohort, which one has to take into account when one thinks about historical factors. And then, of course, the experience of these cumulative risks is associated with experience of need. And you can see that, especially in the later born cohort, not only do they have more risks, they also are more strongly associated with their experience of need in their transition to employment. And then looking again at the combinations and trying to find out basically who are the ones who are resilient, i.e. they have high risk, structural risk, but they do not experience need. So this is our expected focused outcome, and we contrast it against those who have high risk and basically experience need, which is what you would expect. But I must say we also find in the LSYPE the unexpected vulnerability of young people who have low risk, so they have lots of parental resources, but still they encounter experience of need. So needs can hit everybody, but more likely those with vulnerabilities. But in this presentation I now want to focus on those, what are the factors that enable young people with high structural risk to avoid the experience of need and to make it against the odds. And to explore these factors, I draw on the Toyashic model of resilience that identifies key protective factors enabling young people to beat the odds. There is a lot of literature on these factors comprising either individual attributes, i.e. previous academic attainment, aspirations and engagement in the school context, as well as early engagement in the labour market. There were a number of studies by J.L. Mortimer in particular who found the beneficial effect of having already exposure to the labour market already while in school, doing part-time jobs, doing newspapers, cleaning cars or whatever. That's were jobs that were available for young people, and that proved to be a beneficial factor. Then there are the characteristics of the family. In addition to the structural resources, we can look at the parental education aspirations and their support for the young people, i.e. how much do they try to teach their children and raise their aspirations, as well as characteristics of the wider social context, i.e. the school characteristics, as well as area characteristics that can play a role. And then in one paper, again, we compared experience in BCS and LSYPE to get some handle on the generalizability. And you can see that for the BCS 70 cohort, when we include these individual characteristics and family characteristics over and above the cumulative social risk score, the social risk score becomes non-significant, so they can basically fully counterbalance this risk, while in the later born cohort that is no longer the case. And potential protective factors are in particular the prior academic attainment, their school motivation, in the later born cohort also their aspirations. Even so, most of the young people want to continue in education. Those who do not want to continue, they are more likely to experience needs, so it plays a role if you are engaged in the education system. While the experience of a part-time job at age 16, it had a beneficial effect for the LSYP, for the British cohort study born in 1970 to avoid need, while it had no longer effect for LSYPE, basically indicating that these jobs are gone. There are no more part-time jobs available for young people in the school system, and also later on it's more difficult for them to find employment. And parents didn't figure in the model, but then we did some more analysis, and basically parental aspirations are fully mediated by these individual factors, their aspirations and engagement. So that is, so you have to look at more pathway models to understand these dynamics between these different factors and how they interact. And also school characteristics remains as independent influence. And if the social mix of the school, i.e. lots of children with or lots of children with free school meals and so on in the school context, so relatively disadvantaged context, then they are also less likely to avoid the need and to become need. So the school characteristics also play a role. And this article is published, so that can be read easily. And then did the same analysis in LSYPE, including in this case the area characteristics, which were not part in BCS 70, just to get an understanding of what the area characteristics do for you. And there you can see that area characteristics have an additional influence as well. So if you live in an urban area, you're more likely to maybe find a job. But if you are living in an area that is characterized by general disadvantage, this is the index of multiple disadvantage comprising level of education, employment and crime in the area, that you're less likely to make it and avoid becoming NEET. So these are then the potential protective factors. So in summary, there is a variety of school-to-work transition. There is not the one normative pathway, there is a diversity and more than one optimal pathway. You have seen that even the young people who basically have to fight or to navigate the work employment system, they're quite satisfied about their life, maybe feeling independence. And you also have seen evidence of the importance of individual agency, which has to be supported in the young people to make it, but also the relevance of social structuring, i.e. relative disadvantaged students are more likely to become NEET, and the cumulative risk effects that they accumulate in families. And then these risk effects, on the other hand, one has to consider what they mean in a changing context. And again, now we have a post-recession context, so the risk factors might again have changed and mean different things, especially regarding home ownership, let's say. And then, but we also experience that, we also see that not all young people who have these high risks then become NEET, and some basically are able to overcome the needs. And we have seen a number of factors that can promote it, including prior academic attainment, education aspirations, and school engagement, school characteristics, as well as area characteristics. So both individual and structural factors go hand in hand to support the transitions of young people. And basically, the findings also suggest that in understanding the transitions, one has to look at these multiple factors, has to take a holistic approach to understand how multiple factors combine in the lives of young people, and that there are also then these historical threats, the contextual challenges like the recession that bring then additional stresses, and the structural challenges over and beyond parental background. We also find area characteristics can play a role, as well as the school characteristics. Individual motivations are important, and then of course the life course is not this one trajectory. You can have different turning points and pathways that lead to a positive trajectory, and you have a gradual shift and emerging of new realities in the lives of young people. And what does it mean for transition policies? Basically, the evidence has shown that there is this increasing polarization of risk exposure with these pockets of deep risk, especially for the later born cohort, and that the most vulnerable families need support to overcome these risks. But also that we should prevent young people from this experience of need. And you have seen from the patterns of their employment trajectories that the experience of need can be transitory, that more young people experience some periods of need but can move out of it. So one has to understand that only a very small group in our sampling was 6% who actually had this relatively persistent long-term experience of need, but that most of the other young people have shorter or longer periods of need where they move in and out. And what does it mean for policies? Basically, it means the school context is very important and has to support young people in building up engagement and motivation, and has to engage them to participate in the school context so that they then continue in education. And for those who basically do not want to continue, and there are always some who, even those from relative privileged background, who do not want to go into education. And we did one study on who becomes an entrepreneur, and again, the entrepreneurs are not necessarily the ones who go onto academic track, but they very often then just follow the business of their parents without then going to get degrees. But basically one has to increase the quality of the work-based routes and not repeat the mistakes of the youth training schemes of the 1980s. In some of my previous research, I compared 1958 NCDS cohort and the 1970 BCS 70 cohort, and there was a distinct cluster of those who basically participated in the youth training schemes, which was then characterized by increasing experience of unemployment later on and increasing problems in making it onto the labor market. But I think another important aspect is to improve the employment opportunities and wages for the low and middle-ranged jobs. and to enable young people who actually do not go to university, and it will always be a percentage of young people who do not go into this royal route that is well signposted and supported, and that these young people also find pathways to financial independence and to make their own living. And I think there are now debates about raising wages, but I think it's also important to raise the structure of employment, because there is a lot of temporary work, 0-hour contracts or agency work where young people do not get any prospect of continuous employment and have to fight their way from one employment, short-term employment, to the next. And I think these are things we wanted to discuss with you. Thank you. So I think this is now open for discussion. Oops, now it's complete darkness. So I will leave these slides and look forward to your questions and comments.
Yeah, so thanks, a really fascinating presentation. As I said, open to questions. Anyone?
And comments and suggestions
any
on policy
questions?
implications?
When you ask a question, can you just say your name and where you're from? And then, so, over the floor. No? Shall I get the ball rolling? Okay. Loads of stuff that's really fascinating in there. One of the things that struck me was the difference between the two cohorts, the 1970 cohort and the 1990 cohort. I think from what you said is that the risk factors are lower, but the overall chances of being neat seem to be twice as high. Can I ask you to, and also you talked about polarisation of risk, can I ask you to expand a little bit on that, and why these got these such large differences?
Of the accumulation of...
Or no, just the differences between the chances of neat between the 1970 cohort and the 1990 cohort there. Yeah, so 16 versus 7%, despite the fact that the risk factor should be lower. Is that right? Or
Yes, I think it is basically because there are less employment opportunities for young. As I said, this structure of the employment market does not really... there is not much space for young people where they can go, and so I think that is a major concern, that we should provide employment for young people who might not have these degree qualifications.
But so if this is the case, then do we have better labor market structure in late 80s, for example? My name is Francesca Zil from Delivery, by the way.
Right. I mean, I think unemployment rates were maybe at similar level for the BCS 70 cohort than for the LSYPE cohort, but I think in the current status you get more benefit if you have more experience in the labor market, and I think maybe for BCS 70 it was easier to enter the labor market without experience, so there are more demands on who gets a job, and those who have lower qualifications and made it into the labor market, let's say 5 or 10 years ago, they then have more evidence that they actually can perform on the job. So I think there is an issue. What jobs are available for young people who have low to medium level qualifications only and no experience?
And does that explain why, because one of the other things I thought was interesting, and it's something that the Commission has found as well, is that the impact of early engagement with the labour market. So if you combine part-time work with your education, you're less likely to be needs later on. And it's certainly what all our evidence from employers tells us as well. But again, the evidence showed that effect had seemed to diminish. And is that because, as you said, there are just fewer chances to get that sort of work?
Yes, yes, exactly. Yes.
Well, out of interest, we've got a project at the moment looking at why is that from the structure of the labour market point of view. Hopefully get that published before but there's all sorts of changes going on to do with the hours and the sort of occupations going on.
And what do you conclude in that?
Sorry?
What do you conclude in that about?
Oh, we haven't finished it yet, so it's underway. Yeah, don't worry. Well, as soon as it gets forward, we'll let you know. So I was just hopefully we'll get it finished before the election, and we'll get it out there.
Lynn Proctor from Pimlico Academy. I thought your point about the young people, they're very well signposted to go to university, and there's so little support for them doing something else. What do we do about that, really? Because, you know, if you think about somebody going into an apprenticeship they're 16 or 17, they may have to go through one of those assessment centres, they may have to write a CV, and they might have to write the CV over and over again, whereas their UKCES statement will be one UKCES statement very well helped by teachers who know what they're writing about because it's education as opposed to something that's employment. It's a struggle actually to help them because they're the ones that need the most help.
Exactly.
I don't know what I'm just saying. I think it's an issue for us all, really,
Yes.
isn't it? To see
So,
how.
yeah. And I think this should be put into the debate that there is evidence, there is basically no support for these young people straight out of school, no experience and low to medium level skills.
Yes, and I think somebody's pointed out too that statistically it's easier to get into Oxbridge than to get
On the
into
TWC,
some of the quality
absolutely.
apprenticeships.
It's
Yeah.
quite right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Dan Hooper from the Federation of Small Businesses, just drawing on what they made earlier, which is, I mean, you mentioned there that more people are staying on education in the LFYP cohort than the BCS, but is that, do you think, drawn out of necessity in terms of we have this sort of social, cultural fear that if we don't get along in life, or do you think it's out of necessity for needing a job because there isn't jobs out there for them?
The reasons why young people go into higher education.
More and more people seem to stay in education, but the labour market doesn't seem to support that sort of connection.
So you mean that the returns for staying on in education are not are reducing?
They've
or?
been reduced since 1970 to the 1990s.
Yes, and they're even reduced now for graduates. And I think because it is like a cohort effect, if all your peers go to further and higher education, you think you lose out if you don't do it. And you find, I think that in one of the other papers that I have written, you find evidence that there is this increasing urge to or pressure to continue education, even for those who do not want to do it, and also those who do not necessarily have the highest possible academic attainments, but they get opportunities to participate in education anyway. So I think there should be rethinking of what sort of alternatives can one offer to young people who do not want to go to education. And these can be also be those who come from relatively privileged backgrounds and apprenticeships, and so they have a very low status in the hierarchy of jobs, even so they could lead you in the end to find employment. You might get less pay, but you still, by accumulating your pay, you can make it onto the housing ladder and have also your other independence. So I think that's what I wanted to urge. That's why I'm happy about the opportunity to be here, to urge this point that there needs to be better employment opportunities for young people.
I'm interested in the differences between the two cohorts and whether you see a similar pattern repeating itself in other European countries as well. Or is it something that's more marked in the UK in terms of the difficulty, the increasing difficulty for young people finding employment?
I think it's mirrored as well in other countries, but other countries most often had already the compulsory school leaving age by age 18. And so some countries have then very good dual system, but even the German system where they have, let's say, the dual system, you find now increasing number of young people, they're called in the transition phase. Basically, they do not make it into the apprenticeships, they do not make it into the dual system, and they're also left behind. So I think there is, it's not always the right solution to have this dual system. You basically have to, one, provide support for those who basically have to find their way between 16 and 18 and finding their pathway. And I think education still is the royal pathway. It gives you the better returns, and I think maybe one of the solutions is to facilitate more lifelong learning and return to education, because we find, for example, evidence also in the previous cohorts that those who were engaged, who did like school and also did do well but left school for a number of reasons, they returned later to education. And maybe one has to rethink this one-stop education phase and provide opportunities for lifelong learning and skilling up and getting the necessary qualification, maybe while being employed, to then also climb on the employment ladder. Once you have collected your experiences in a job, you then might want to upskill and get further qualifications.
Yes. Can I just say, on the other European countries, the other factor that's quite important is demographic trends, because in Germany as well, they have had a similar problem and have been warehousing young people in many respects in this transition programme, but they see that as very short term because their birth rate has dropped so dramatically that they think these are going to ease through, there's going to be more jobs than young people to fill them, and that's starting to happen already. So you do get different demographic contexts. In fact, I think we've got demographic downturn coming here as well. That does change the dynamics somewhat.
Katie Morris from the Education and Employers Task Force. I think we're very interested in the findings around area characteristics. Could you say a little bit more about how strong those effects are in the LSYP, and what you think it means for policy, particularly targeting resources at particular places?
I mean, the effect is very strong, it's highly significant, and I think, for example, in one of the studies we found that young people with workless parents, if they then also live in an area with high area disadvantage, they're less likely to succeed and make it against the odds. So I think it is an important issue to be considered, that there are some pockets where there are no employment opportunities even for adults. But I think
the furlong work on neighbourhoods as well.
Yes.
Found this. It's not so much labour markets, but it's smaller units, it's neighbourhoods. That's an important factor.
Yes, so that there could also be co-regulation not only in the family but also in neighbourhoods. And if you live in neighbourhoods where everybody is not in employment, it is of course more difficult to then make it and find your first rank or make it into the labour market.
I mean, this is just a comment really more than anything else, but I mean, there's a difficulty, isn't there, trying to sort of judge what is a good trajectory and what's not a good trajectory. I mean, particularly when you're looking at people between the ages. Sorry, I'm Richard Dawson from the National Institute of Economic and Social Research.
And lakes.
And lakes, yeah. That satisfaction one was interesting. You know, I mean, is it a good thing to have a strong employment presence in that age group, or is it preferable that people invest more in their own education and proceed subsequently to sort of command higher wages? And I think this chart's kind of interesting, because I mean one way that you could say is, well, just ask people how happy they are, and this you've got quite a clear indication, I suppose, and that the only thing that seems statistically significantly different from the rest is the NEET category at the end.
Yes.
Even those that go on to be NEET after having some education seems sort of not so bad, you know. But I mean, if you're going that far right route, then you're in some sort of trouble. But I mean, other than that, distinguishing between people that go down an education pathway and an employment pathway, and in a sense that this age the jury's out, isn't it? Because you know they're still in this kind of process of finding their feet.
Yes. Basically, it shows that there are multiple optimal pathways in the experience of young people, and maybe one should rethink that there are only these two routes and provide them alternatives. Again, to encourage or support more young people to have some employment experiences. Also, what we have seen from the studies by Jail and Mortimer and in BCS 17, that these employment-related experiences not only then might contribute to life satisfaction, but they might also contribute to you then finding employment later on.
So what is the pure education outcome? The ACA?
Yes, the academic track,
right.
Yes.
But I mean, the point is, it might be optimal now, but it might turn out to be very suboptimal later on, which is, means well, we'll be able to track this through the cohort studies, but it does mean that you need more routes open to return to education, and that you know, the what's optimal for you at this time might not be in the future, so you need that flexibility to come back, and that's, I think, the lifelong learning report that Tom Schuller and David Watson produced. That was one of their big recommendations, that actually this front loading of everything, and you know, it's education then work, and there's stacking the resources into that sort of model is
Yeah.
it needs to be looked at again with many more opportunities for return to education, supported by resources later in life.
I agree with that, but at the same time you could argue that to the extent that people are able, to the extent that people's predictions of their future prospects are reflected in their current evaluations of life satisfaction, that these are informative distinctions across these groups.
I mean, looking at the data, I was quite smitten by the optimism, especially those who were in employment. They described their job, this job I enjoyed, it's a springboard to future opportunities, and all these positive comments about the job. But then there was also a question, do you think you will still be in the same job next year? No. So that is so these young people are really prepared to take the risk and to get all these employment experiences. But I think these experiences should also be made available to them. There is great of optimism, there is great of, also young people are engaged and want to contribute to society, and I think that should not be undermined, it should be supported and fostered.
Right, guys, unless anyone's got a really quick question, I think we're pretty much out of time. Anyone? No? Well, in that case, let's thank Ingrid and Karen for their excellent presentation.